you very much for the invitation to come and share with you this morning.
多謝大家嘅今日喺當中嘅邀請，一齊分享聖經。
Why don't we pray?
我哋一齊祈禱。
Heavenly Father, please open my mouth to speak your word.
真係天父，佢打開我口，然後講你嘅話語。
Open our ears to hear your word.
開我哋耳朵去聽你嘅説話。
And please direct our wills to obey your word.
讓我哋嘅意志都能夠係順服你嘅帶領。
For Jesus' sake.
因住主耶穌基督名求。
Amen.
Amen.
There are some stains that cannot easily be removed.
有啲污跡係唔咁容易去掉。
They penetrated so far into the fabric, into that shirt or the carpet, and they stubbornly resist every effort to remove it.
呢啲污跡係深入到恤衫或者地氈嘅裏邊，係好難被清除。
Some injuries are so deep they are not easily mended.
有啲傷口太深，係唔容易埋口。
It takes medical skill and prolonged recovery time, and sometimes rehab and physiotherapy, and even then, lasting consequences can remain.
啲傷口係需要醫生嘅處理同埋較長時間嘅康復時間，有時候咧康復同埋藥物嘅調理，即使如此，都會留下後遺症。
And some trauma is so devastating we cannot easily recover.
有啲創傷帶來非常重大嘅破壞性，我哋好難去恢復過嚟。
I suspect you know that all from your experience.
我想你會知道，從你自己經驗裏邊都會經歷過，明白點解。
You can do the quick wipe over, try the instant remedy, speak the easy word, and it just doesn't work.
你可以好快將佢抹掉，又或者可以嘗試即時補救，或者説呢啲係好容易嘅話，但係都冇用嘅。
In fact, it often makes the problem worse. The stains, smudges, the insensitive word can cause even more pain.
但事實上咧，往往我哋咁做，只係將問題咧係變得更糟，污跡變得更大，冷漠嘅言語會帶來更大嘅痛苦。
And if you've ever been in such a situation, perhaps you've realised that you've underestimated the problem, underestimated the damage, and so underestimated just what it will take to set things right.
如果你遇到咁嘅情況，或者你意識到咧，其實你低估咗問題嘅嚴重性，低估咗損害，亦都低估咗你解決問題嘅方法。
I think it's very easy for us to underestimate the problem we all face as human beings.
我哋或者我哋知道，我哋好容易低估我哋作為人類，低估咗人類所面臨嘅種種問題。
We are those who are created by the one true and living God.
我係由一真神所創造嘅人。
We've been placed in the world that He created so that we might live in joyful fellowship with Him.
我哋被安置喺神所創造嘅世界裏邊，然後同一齊快樂地生活，同埋有彼此相交。
But it's all a mess, and the problem arises from inside us.
但由於我哋自己所出現嘅問題，呢啲一切都變成一團糟。
It bursts out in the desire to live in God's world on our terms, to decide for ourselves what is good and what is not good.
個問題嘅爆發，由於我哋想按照我哋嘅想法去生活喺神嘅世界裏面，為自己決定乜嘢係對我哋自己有益，乜嘢係對我哋自己不利。
I suspect most of us know the problem.
我哋知道大家都知道人類嘅問題係咩。
We see it playing out in a large scale in the world and on a small scale in the intimate scale of our lives.
我哋見到人類嘅問題唔單止係世界嘅舞台裏面發生，但又會喺我哋嘅生活裏邊更少、更親密嘅範圍裏面上演。
And many people think they have an idea of how to fix it.
但好多人認為咧，佢有解決問題嘅方案。
But do we really?
但係真係有冇？
Is it just possible the problem is more intractable than we've imagined and the solution is more devastating?
係咪問題比我哋想象更拿手，而我哋解決嘅方法係更破壞性？
This morning I want to take you to Matthew's Gospel and the Garden of Gethsemane.
今日早上想帶你去馬 馬太福音同埋客西馬尼園。
It is one of those moments in Matthew's Gospel when we get a glimpse of who Jesus really is and what Jesus did really involved.
嗱，呢個係馬太福音其中重要嘅時刻，喺嗰度我哋可以一見耶穌真實嘅身份同埋耶穌真正要做嘅事。
We see the real humanity of Jesus, much, much more than just skin deep.
我哋見到耶穌真正人性唔係好膚淺嘅睇法。
We also get to see the genuine glory of his divinity, the true Son of the Father and the only one who can save us.
我哋見到佢真正嘅榮耀，佢真正天父嘅兒子，亦都係唯一能夠拯救我哋嘅人。
And we catch just a glimpse of just what was going on at the cross.
我哋可以睇一睇乜嘢事情發生喺十字架上面。
And these are such important things for us to see. It's really very good that we get a chance to look at this passage.
呢件事情係非常重要。今日早上咧，我哋有機會嚟睇到呢段經文。
So if you have your Bibles, could you open them to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36?
我哋一齊係睇馬太福音嘅26章。我喺屏幕上面又好，我哋打喺聖經度好。由我去讀出。耶穌和門徒來到一個地方，名叫客西馬尼。他對他們說：你們坐在這裏，我到那邊去禱告。於是帶着彼得和西庇太的兩個兒子同去，他憂愁起來，極其難過，就對他們說：我心裏非常憂傷，幾乎要死。你們留在這裏，和我一同警醒。他就稍往前走，俯伏在地，禱告說：我父啊，如果可能，求你使這杯離開我。然而，不是照我所願的，而是照你所願的。他回到門徒那裏，見他們睡着了，就對彼得說：怎樣？你們不能同我警醒1小時嗎？總要警醒禱告，免得陷入試探。你們的心靈固然願意，肉體卻唔容易。他第二次又去禱告說：我父啊，這杯若不能離開我，必須我喝，就願你的旨意成全。他又來見他們睡着了，因為他們的眼睛困倦。耶穌離開他們，第3次去禱告，說的話跟先前一樣。然後他們來到門徒那裏，對他們說：現在你們仍睡覺安歇嗎？看啊，時候到了，日子被出賣在罪人手裏了。起來，我們走吧。看啊，那出賣我哋嘅人快來。
It was the Thursday night of the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry.
呢個係一個星期4嘅晚上，係耶穌最後嘅一個嘅時代。
It was the week of the Passover, the night the Passover meal was shared in every Jewish family.
呢個逾越節嘅最後一個晚上，每個猶太家庭都共享呢個逾越節嘅晚餐。
But you might remember when Jesus shared the Passover with his disciples, in the verses just before this passage, he redirected the focus of the Passover from the deliverance from Egypt to himself.
但係你可能記得喺呢個經文之前嘅當中，喺逾越節，當耶穌同佢門徒分享嘅時候，佢將逾越節嘅焦點咧係從慶祝出埃及嘅拯救，係轉移到新嘅焦點。佢要做咩咧
This is my body, he said.
佢話：這是我身體。
This is my blood of the covenant, shed for many for the forgiveness of sins, he said.
呢個係我流嘅血，為好多人流血，使罪得赦。
It would be possible to look at this incident entirely from the perspective of the disciples.
我哋可以從耶穌第一批門徒嘅角度嚟睇下佢點睇呢件事。
What happened in the garden was such a stark contrast to what they all just said as they made their way from the upper room of the city to the garden just outside the city walls.
喺城外客西馬尼花園發生嘅事，同埋剛剛喺城上樓上嘅房間吃逾越節晚餐所發生嘅事咧，形成好鮮明嘅一個對比。
Even if I must die with you, I will most certainly not deny you, Peter has said.
彼得話：就算我必須同死，我絕對唔會唔認你。
And all the disciples said the same.
所有門徒都咁講。
They were in this to the end.
佢哋會一齊同耶穌一齊嘅。
They would stand their ground.
佢哋會堅持個立場嘅。
They would not draw back.
佢哋唔會退縮嘅。
They would stand up and be counted no matter what the cost.
佢哋會挺身而出，唔管付咩嘅代價。
But if we keep our eyes on them in these verses, we see monumental failure.
當我哋喺留意呢個經文嘅時候，我哋見到佢哋巨大嘅失敗。
The 12 of them failed.
12個人都失敗。
And so did the three Jesus took a little further with him, Peter, James and John.
耶穌帶咗3人係彼得、雅各同埋約翰。
Jesus took them with him some way into the garden.
佢帶佢哋去咗唔知某個地方。
He told them to watch and wait.
佢叫佢哋等候警醒。
But they could not even do that.
但係咁樣都做唔到。
For all their protest of loyalty and devotion, they could not do what needed to be done that night.
佢哋一再表示忠誠，但係喺嗰天晚上冇完成需要完成做嘅事。
They fell asleep.
佢哋瞓覺。
Weren't you strong enough to watch with me for 1 hour? Jesus asked when he returned for the first time.
耶穌第一次回到佢就問佢哋：你哋唔能夠同我警醒1小時嗎？
And the answer was pretty obvious, wasn't it? No.
我哋見到個答案係好明顯啊，就係佢哋冇做到。
They weren't up to it.
佢哋冇做。
Jesus was the only one who watched and prayed that night.
喺嗰天晚上，耶穌係唯一警醒同祈禱嘅人。
And he was terrifyingly alone.
佢係非常非常嘅孤單。
What he had to do that night and the next day would be done for them, but not with them.
喺嗰天嘅晚上，第日要做嘅事，耶穌係為佢哋而做嘅，唔係同佢哋一齊做。
It is done by Jesus and by him alone.
呢個係耶穌要做嘅事，就只有佢先能夠去做。
And so the disciples are not really the focus of attention, are they?
所以門徒並唔係我哋真正關注嘅焦點。
As valuable as it seems to be reminded that those disciples like us are weak and fragile, that we can't rely on ourselves and our good intentions, first and foremost, it's about Jesus.
我哋要值得留意，呢啲門徒好似我哋一樣，都係軟弱嘅。我哋唔能夠依賴我哋自己同埋我哋好嘅善意。最主要係聖經將呢事記錄下來嘅時候，就係因為我哋要了解耶穌。
We get to see Jesus here as we have not seen him up to this point in Matthew's Gospel.
我喺呢度所睇見嘅耶穌咧，係我哋喺馬太福音之前未見過嘅耶穌。
The Lord who stilled the storm, who raised the dead, who was not fazed when he was opposed by demons or religious leaders, the one who walked on the water and stood alongside Moses and Elijah on the mountain, the Son of Man with all authority to execute God's plan on earth. He steps into the garden and we see something very different.
我哋見到主紫色光復，使死人復活。當魔鬼同埋宗教領袖反對嘅時候，佢唔會被嚇到。呢個喺水上行走，喺山上同摩西同以利亞並肩站仗嘅人子，佢賦予一個權力喺神上面嘅旨意。但當係入到呢個花園嘅時候，我哋見到另外一個耶穌。
He is sorrowful and troubled.
佢悲傷痛苦。
He's shaken.
佢喺震抖。
In Luke's Gospel, we're told at one point that he was in agony and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground.
喺路加福音裏，作者話俾我哋聽，佢非常痛苦，佢嘅汗水變成大滴嘅血滴喺地上。
So, what was it in the garden that confronted Jesus and brought about such distress?
耶穌喺園中面對嘅係乜嘢帶俾佢咁大嘅痛苦咧？
He faced the devil in the wilderness and didn't even flinch.
佢喺曠野裏邊面對魔鬼係絕對冇退縮。
But here he tells his disciples, "My soul is full of sorrow even to death."
喺呢度佢話俾佢哋聽，我心裏滿心憂愁，甚至要死。
What was the burden that he carried at that moment?
嗰一刻佢背負咗乜嘢？
What was was it that Jesus saw approaching that those around him did not see?
有乜嘢耶穌睇到將會來臨，但喺旁邊嘅人係睇唔到嘅呢？
What was it that caused him to pause and then deliberately choose to, at this time, as throughout his whole ministry, to choose to do the will of him who sent him?
有咩喺呢個最後嘅時刻，有咩使佢刻意停落嚟，地上所有嘅事工去選擇遵行那差他來人嘅旨意呢？
Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is more transparently human than he is anywhere in the Gospel.
喺客西馬尼園嘅耶穌，比福音書其他地方更明顯嘅顯示佢嘅人性。
He was sorrowful and troubled.
佢悲傷，
He was brought to the very edge.
佢被逼到絕境。
What pressed upon him was unbearable.
喺佢壓喺身上係難以接受嘅，
He was almost overwhelmed.
佢幾乎不知所措。
His soul was full of sorrow even to death.
佢嘅靈魂充滿悲傷，甚至死亡。
And so, dear friends, he knows what it's like, what it's really like to be pressed to our limits, to be at breaking point.
佢知道係咩感覺，嗰種被逼到極限、被逼到崩潰嗰個感覺。
He went through that, and he's able to sympathize with us in our weakness.
佢經歷呢個痛苦嘅時候，就能夠同情我哋嘅經歷。
You see, Jesus was not a superhuman, impervious to terror, heading cheerfully to the cross.
你睇耶穌唔係一個超人，唔係冇受恐懼嘅影響，好冇高高興興咁去走嘅十字架。
He wasn't a heroic martyr who defiantly embraces death, and we've seen many of them through history.
佢唔係一個好勇敢地擁抱死亡嘅烈士，我哋喺歷史上見到好多咁嘅人。
Nor was he a stoic, simply resigned to what lies ahead, aiming for that tranquility that comes with an indifference to the circumstances around us, and we've seen plenty of them as well.
佢亦都唔係一個苦行僧，以為簡單嘅係聽命於現前一切嘅周圍嘅環境，可以漠不關心，只係能夠獲得平靜。世上有好多呢啲人。
There was nothing light or superficial about the suffering Jesus went through in the Garden of Gethsemane.
耶穌喺客西馬尼所經歷嘅苦難，唔係一件輕鬆同埋一件膚淺嘅事。
He was genuinely human, and faced with what lay before him, he was in genuine anguish.
佢係一個真正嘅人，係擺咗面一切嘅痛苦嘅時候，佢真係感受真正嘅痛苦。
His genuine and full humanity is seen as well in the way he placed his will at the service of his Father's will.
佢耶穌將自己意願放下，去順從天父旨意嘅時候，喺呢度我哋睇到佢真正嘅人性。
He had been dedicated to his Father's will all through his ministry.
係完全嘅人喺佢整個嘅侍奉裏面都完全效忠係神嘅旨意。
My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work, he said at one point.
耶穌講到：我嘅食物就係遵行那差我來那位嘅旨意。
I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me, he said at another.
佢喺第六地方講，因為佢哋天上降臨不係按自己旨意行，而係遵行差我來那位嘅旨意。
And at the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus had answered the first test from the devil in the wilderness with words from Deuteronomy. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.
耶穌出時嘅時候，出嚟嘅時候，用生命嘅話回答一個係魔鬼嘅考驗。人活着不是單靠食物，乃是靠神口裏所出嘅條話。
That is how human beings were meant to live.
呢個佢話俾我哋聽，我哋人類就應該咁嘅生活。
Directed by the word of God, embracing the will of God.
係接受神嘅話語，擁抱神嘅旨意。
That is when human living is fully human living.
咁樣做，人類嘅生活先真正係人嘅生活。
Jesus' will didn't stand over against God's will, challenging God's will, wrestling with God's will.
耶穌自己嘅意願係冇係對抗神嘅旨意，冇挑戰神嘅旨意，亦都係唔係與神嘅旨意係爭鬥。
His will was most fully human when it was aligned with the Father's will.
佢旨意係同父嘅旨意係一樣嘅時候，佢嘅旨意係最神聖。
And his will was most fully divine when he embraced the Father's will.
即係講緊完全嘅人性。當佢嘅意志係包含佢天父嘅旨意嘅時候，佢嘅意志係最神聖。
Not my will but yours was not a momentary decision for Jesus.
不是我所願的，而是照你所願的。對耶穌嚟講，唔係個一個一瞬間嘅決定。
The but or the however in verse 39 was not a change of mind on Jesus' part.
喺39節裏邊嘅然而，唔係話耶穌改變佢主意。
This had been a pattern his whole life.
呢個就係佢喺當中佢嘅生命就係咁樣。
Not my will but yours was never a sign of weakness or indecision or lack of faith in Jesus.
呢個嘅生命模式唔係照我所願嘅，係照你所願嘅，從來都唔係代表軟弱、優柔寡斷或者對耶穌缺乏信心嘅表現。
And it's never a sign of weakness or indecision or lack of faith in us.
對於我哋嚟講，我哋遵行神嘅旨意都唔係軟弱、優柔寡斷、缺乏信心。
Not my will but yours is the very character of Christian prayer.
不是照我所願的，而是照你所願的，係基督徒祈禱嘅道。
This intimate exchange between Jesus and his Father displays Jesus, our Saviour, as genuinely human and genuinely divine.
耶穌同天父之間呢種親密嘅交流，顯示俾我哋睇，耶穌救主係真正嘅人，亦都係真正嘅神。
It demonstrates too that what is happening at this point and all through the next chapters has its real centre here in the eternal, unbreakable relation of the Father and the Son.
嗱，呢個就證明一點就係所發生嘅事同埋跟住發生嘅事，你幾章以後發生嘅事，重心係聖父同聖子有永恆連接嘅關係。
What was happening in the garden reveals God's saving activity is deeply personal and relational. It's never impersonal or external or transactional.
喺亞西馬利園所發生嘅事，顯示神拯救人類係非常個人化、非常關係化，唔係非人嘅，唔係對外嘅，又都唔係交易嘅。
Its power lies not in the law, but in the common will of the Father and the Son.
佢嘅力量唔係在於律法，而係在於聖父同聖子一同嘅意願。
Did you notice on both occasions when we hear the words Jesus prayed, we hear my Father?
大家有冇留意啊？喺兩次嘅聽過祈禱耶穌祈禱嘅時候，佢都有話我的父開頭。
So I come back to the question, what was it that Jesus saw approaching that brought such agony at the same time as he consciously, deliberately chose to do his Father's will?
嗱，如果我哋翻返嗰個問題裏邊，有乜嘢喺耶穌好有意識地故意去選擇執行天父嘅意願嘅同時咧，亦面對着咧咁大嘅痛苦咧，乜嘢事咧？
It was not the prospect of death itself which terrified him most.
佢害怕嘅唔係死亡本身。
Nor even the physically excruciating nature of the death that lay before him.
更唔係要面對所帶來肉體上嘅痛苦。
Certainly those things brought distress.
嗱，當然呢啲事咧，佢會帶來痛苦。
He knew how disruptive and unnatural human death always is.
佢知道人類嘅死亡總係有破壞性咧，同埋唔自然嘅。
He did not relish the physical agony of the cross.
佢亦都唔係去享受十字架俾佢身體上嘅痛苦。
But what really terrifies him becomes clear in the words that he prays.
真正令佢恐懼嘅，從佢嘅祈禱裏面，我哋可以睇出線索。
My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, as you will.
我父啊，如果可能，求你是這杯離開我，然而不是照我所願的，而是照你所願的。
The issue is the cup.
問題就係嗰個杯。
Not long ago, Jesus had a cup in his hands, and he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for you and for the forgiveness of sins."
不久以前，耶穌手裏拿住杯來說： 這是我立了的血，為眾人流血流出來，使罪得赦。
But that's not the cup he has in mind here.
但係呢個唔係喺佢思想裏面嗰個杯。
The cup is a familiar image throughout the Old Testament, containing God's righteous indignation against willful human rebellion.
喺整個舊約裏邊，杯俾我哋一個熟悉嘅形象。杯就係上帝對人類蓄意反叛所發出嘅公義憤怒。
Yes. So Isaiah 51.
喺以賽亞書51章同埋咧耶利米書以賽亞書51章，耶路撒冷啊，興起興起，站起來！你從耶和華手中喝了他憤怒的杯，那詩人東倒西歪的杯，直到喝盡。跟住喺耶利米書25章，又話：以色列上帝對我兒子説：你從我手中拿這杯憤怒的酒，給我所差遣去的各國的百姓喝。
What distinguished the death that Jesus was facing from every other death is this, that as he suffered and died there, he, the beloved Son, was drinking the cup of God's wrath.
耶穌所面對嘅死亡同其他人嘅死亡個區別在於咧，佢受苦嘅時候，喺死在佢嘅時候，就係佢愛子喝下咗神憤怒之杯。
He would be delivered over, as he himself said, into the hands of sinners.
正如佢自己所說，佢會被交付喺罪人嘅手中。佢哋
They would do their worst, and it would seem as if they triumphed.
佢哋會做最壞嘅事就係釘死耶穌。喺旁觀者角度嚟講，表面看來佢哋呢班人已經勝利。
That's all many onlookers would see.
但喺表面嘅勝利之下，
But concealed under their apparent triumph was the triumph of God, as Jesus dealt with a problem much, much deeper and much more serious than we realise, and he dealt with it properly, fully, and none of it remains.
喺呢個表面嘅勝利之下，隱存在神嘅勝利。因為耶穌處理嘅問題方法比我哋深刻得多，嚴重得多。而耶穌處理得恰當、充分，完全解決所有嘅問題。
Everything that human sin rightly deserved is drained away, not by some arm's length transaction, but by God's own acceptance of his cup of wrath.
人類犯罪所應得嘅一切都被抹去、沖走啦。唔係通過呢個正常公平嘅交易，而係神自己接受自己，神自己接受給人憤怒嘅杯。
And there would be nothing left when he drained that cup.
當耶穌飲完嗰個杯之後，再冇任何一滴嘅審判係留俾我哋。
So don't let anyone tell you that our salvation is easy.
唔好聽人講，我哋得到拯救係好容易。
It was immensely costly.
係非常昂貴。
And the glory of it is that the cost was all borne by him.
係非常榮耀嘅，因為所有嘅代價都係由耶穌所承擔。
That's what Jesus saw approaching that night, and he was rightly terrified.
呢個就係晚上耶穌所要面對嘅，係令他好痛苦、恐懼。
He saw and felt the great burden of the world, stained, injured, and traumatized by human sin, and entirely unable to avoid God's judgment.
佢感到呢個世界嘅重擔同埋捆綁，呢個世界係被人類罪污所玷污、所傷害同埋創傷，而係無法避免神正確、完美同埋可怕嘅審判。
But because of this single, determined grasping of the cup, as one man put it, there's none of it left for us to drink.
但係由於喺呢個園子裏邊，耶穌一心一意嘅握住神憤怒嘅杯，正如有人説，審判一滴不留，我哋唔再需要飲呢個杯。
This moment in the garden, as well as demonstrating once again the weakness of the disciples and their need to be saved,
喺園子嘅呢刻，同樣證明咗門徒嘅軟弱同埋佢自己嘅需要。
Showed the real humanity of Jesus,
展示耶穌真正嘅人性，
the genuine divinity of Jesus,
展示咗耶穌真正嘅神性，
and the true nature of the cross of Jesus.
展現咗耶穌十字架嘅真正嘅本質。
And there's one last thing that it demonstrated that's important for us to recognize.
係最後一件事證明，佢帶我哋睇對我哋好重要。
The prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane makes clear there is only one way to be saved.
喺客西馬利亞講到嘅禱告，好清楚表明只有一種嘅拯救方法。
There was simply no other way to achieve the salvation of men and women than God Himself, in the person of His Son, draining the cup of His own wrath.
除咗神之外，除咗喺個兒子嘅身上喝盡佢自己憤怒之杯以外，再沒有其他嘅方法喺拯救喺罪裏邊嘅男人同女人。
The stain is so deep, the injury is so severe, the trauma is so devastating that nothing else is able to answer the problem.
污跡係如此嘅深，傷口係如此嘅嚴重，創傷係如此嘅毀滅，冇乜嘢能夠解決呢個問題。
And we know that once again by the words Jesus prayed.
我哋睇通過耶穌嘅話，我哋再一次知道，
Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done.
我父啊，如果可能，求你使這杯離開我，然而不是照我所願的，而是照你所願的。
My Father, it is not possible for this to pass unless I drink it. Let your will be done.
我父啊，如果不可能使這杯離開我，除非我喝了，照你所願。
And what is clear from this incident, as Jesus and his disciples are joined by the betrayer and the host who came with him, is that it was not possible.
喺呢個好清楚呢件事嘅結尾裏邊，當背叛耶穌嘅人帶住嗰啲人嚟嘅時候，耶穌已經唔可能離開呢個杯嘅。
There was no other way.
再冇其他嘅方法。
When someone says to you that Jesus is just one of many ways to God, the answer lies here.
當有人話我哋通往神有好多嘅途徑之一，有好多嘅途徑，係咪咧？答案就喺呢度。
Jesus himself anticipated the question. If it is possible, he said.
耶穌自己睇到呢個問題啦，佢話如果可能，
But it was not.
但係佢唔係，
He is the only one who could drink that cup.
佢係唯一能夠飲呢個杯嘅。
He is the only one who would triumph in the darkness.
佢唯一係黑暗嗰度得勝嘅。
What God has given us in this record of what went on in the Garden of Gethsemane is a glimpse into the most important moment in universal history.
聖經記載俾我哋喺神喺客西馬尼所做嘅，讓我哋睇到宇宙歷史裏邊最重要嘅時刻。
We see why the cross matters.
我哋知道點解十字架重要。
We see what God was prepared to do.
我哋見到神準備
What God himself was prepared to bear to save us.
神自己點樣承擔做呢樣嘢，
And isn't that amazing?
佢請教我哋，呢個係咪一個奇異嘅？
Amen.
我哋一齊起立。